everybody. Thanks for joining us here tonight to talk about how podcasts are the new essays. My name is Biz Summers.
And I'm Katie Fielding.
And we're really happy you're here joining us on what for us is a snow day eve, and maybe for you also.
Yes, we get to sleep in tomorrow and, just make some cookies.
I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, maybe we'll make a podcast about it.
Absolutely. So let's, without further ado, let's go ahead and just dive right into podcasting. So we're going to share a lot of information today, and it's if you don't want to take notes, I'm not great at taking notes. We have everything we talk about and probably a lot more at this resource, podcasts.unisonedu.org. And so if you point your browser there, it'll take you to a Wakelet full of all kinds of resources, links to everything we talk about, and some instructional documents as well. Templates, that's the word I'm looking for. So let's jump into it. So we're going to start talking about just how students consume content. It's just a huge part of what they do. And podcasting in general is becoming more and more of a common form of content that students listen to. More than half of Americans listen to podcasts, and the biggest demographic is ages, I want to say 12 to 21. And that's just growing every day. Katie, what got you into the whole podcasting thing?
Well, I had listened to podcasts for quite a while. I guess probably 8 years I've been a podcast listener. And then I just thought oh, how can we get this into classrooms? How can we apply this? And then along with, you and Dan and Billy, we've just kind of been doing this in our schools for a while. I even built a podcast studio, and it's been really successful.
Yeah, same. For me, it also started as just a thing to listen to. It was just a hobby that I enjoyed, and in the same way that we watch videos, so we ask our kids to make videos, we consume content through our ears, and it's great to ask kids to do the same thing. And also, just the idea of getting into podcasting for me made me think it's something that's fun. I enjoy creating content, and so why wouldn't students also?
Yeah, everyone. I think most people, even if they're not comfortable being on video, are comfortable talking, maybe in some respect. And so podcasts, I think, are a little more accessible for a lot of students.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Especially, I work in a middle school, and so there are a lot of kids, even like when I assign a Flipgrid assignment to them, who will find a way to put a sticker over their face or just cover the camera or whatever it takes to hide their face, but they don't mind sharing their actual voice with me.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's a little bit more freeing, almost like your internet personality. When you don't have to share your face, you can be a little bit more relaxed.
Yeah, absolutely. What makes you feel like it is important to share via podcast specifically, beyond just going to be more relaxed?
Oh, well, I think it, as this slide talks about, amplifying the student voice, giving them a space to talk about what they want to talk about. I think podcasts are great in that, you're giving the students choice in what they're going to talk about. Usually, you're not going to assign something very concrete for a podcast. You really want to have that levity of letting them choose the direction that the podcast is going to go. And then, so you're giving them that choice, and then you're giving them a space to share their voice.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think you really hit on the fact that choice is a big part of it. I've found that my students have been most engaged with this kind of project when they have more of a say in where it's going. So either A, they have a choice about how they're going to complete a project, like if they want to do a video or they want to do a podcast or they want to write a paper, that choice has been really important for them. But also the more choice they have in the direction of that podcast has been really motivating for them.
And I agree with what you just said. Like podcasting should be a choice. It should be one of a variety of options because just like videos aren't for every kid, a podcast isn't for every kid. There may be the kid that's going to thrive more on writing or a kid that's going to thrive more on creating something artistic. So having this be in just your arsenal of options is a great idea.
So we think podcasting is amazing for building those 21st century skills, those 5 C's that we really try to focus on, and just giving kids the chance to go beyond parroting your lesson back to you. Katie, in what ways have you seen that happen when you're podcasting with kids? In what ways have you seen kids just go beyond what is expected of them?
Yeah. So recently there was a student in an English class that I worked with, and they did a podcast about CIA mind control. And then at the end of the podcast, he like did a little clip as if the whole episode had been like mind control. And it was just so cute how cute, but really creative how that kid took the topic that could have been, probably not a dry paper. That's an interesting topic, but really made it creative and put his own slant into it with that little hook at the end.
Oh, I listened to it and it was great. I laughed out loud,
Yeah.
which is great when you can I didn't have to grade this kid's work, but I wanted to listen to it because it was authentically interesting. For me, I would say and we talked about choice already, but the more space I've given my students to do what they want to do, the more I've seen them do ridiculous things. So I have a club that meets after school. We did face-to-face and we're trying to revamp it during the pandemic. But last year, I gave them some choices about what types of products they would produce and total leeway on what they put into it. So it was more about learning the skills of video production and creating a podcast, and the content was up to them entirely. And watching them, I had this one student who was just, I don't know, maybe this is a little awkward, but she was fascinated with serial killers. And and that was just all she wanted to read about. And the depth of research that I saw her do, just preparing to get on the podcast and talk about it in a voluntary after school club after 7 hours of learning, to dive in and say, I want to know more and I want to research more deeply. It was just amazing to see her really become just motivated by it.
And I think we all do that like naturally too, right? Like I'm on the couch the other night watching The Crown, and then suddenly I'm 3 hours into like reading all about the royal family on the internet. So I think once we find something like we're interested in, we're willing to go on deep dives, and students are too. And and then they're going to take that deep dive and turn it into something cool.
Yeah. And just adding on to the 21st century skills too, I have to add that she had so much fun doing it that she started talking to a friend about it. And then the friend asked me if she could join the club. So she came and joined us after school, and they would research together. And just sit there on side-by-side devices, comparing notes and asking each other questions and working on playing an episode. It was amazing.
Yeah, I love that it gets kids to collaborate and work together. And this is definitely something, even in remote environments, kids can work on podcasts together. So I think, a lot of kids are seeking that interaction with classmates still. And so this is definitely a viable option.
Right. Yeah. So that absolutely is a great example of how we don't have to feel limited by the pandemic. Katie, I know that you have done active podcasting in class with kids this year in virtual learning. Tell me how that went.
Yeah, it was good. They were all doing individual projects actually. So they were taking their expository essays and turning them into individual podcasts. So for them, it was, there wasn't so much the class collaboration going on because of the remote setting, and it was a dual enrollment class. So a college level course, they had to do an individual paper. / podcast. But yeah, I think it's definitely a viable thing to do remotely, collaboratively. The tools, the technology tools make it easy. You just need to get into, a video conference with someone, whatever tool you're going into using for that, and record yourselves. Jump to that Zoom where it happens.
And hey, we are also living proof of that. We started a podcast during this pandemic, and have not seen each other face to face one time to make
not
that
at
happen.
all. Yeah, and I think it's going pretty well.
Agreed. Do you have any other success stories of kids making global connections or feeling like they're on a larger platform because of a podcast?
Oh, for sure. Especially, when we were in school and we have that formal studio and kids would come in, they could sign up for it after school or during school. And kids would come in, not just to use the studio to get their voice out. They would bring in other people from around the school. They'd have guest people, guest speakers, on their podcast and, working together. And then they were excited to share it with the world and put it out there, and then get the response from their audience. What about you?
Yeah. So I actually, in middle school level, I don't have as much in the way of success stories there because we don't put things on a large platform most of the time because most of my students are under 13. So there's a lot of privacy issues to dig into with that. And so we really focus on sharing with one another. We did participate one year in the NPR podcast challenge. So there was a lot of paperwork in being able to publicly host their submissions.
Mhm.
And we did everything by the book just to make sure we had parental permission and all of those things. But I will say that was probably the most authentic podcasting experience of the various ones I've done in and out of class, where they knew they had an audience of strangers who are going to listen to and judge them. um, we didn't win.
But you
The
had fun
experience,
doing it when the
we had a
experience. Yeah.
ton of fun,
Yeah.
and the kids loved listening to it when they were done and sharing what they'd done, because we worked in several small groups and they loved sharing with each other. And then even more so the next year, they loved listening back to it and seeing how they had grown. And so it was really cool to just have it again hosted publicly so that they could easily access it.
I think that's a great example that, podcasts become part of the student's portfolio, showing that growth. Like you can, portfolios just aren't visual things, and audio pieces, just like in a music class, can be really important. Podcasting can show those same skills.
Yeah, absolutely. So beyond the theory, getting into it,
Yeah, yeah.
there's a ton of ways to bring it into school, and I think we're mostly focusing on how teachers use it in classrooms. What's your favorite way that teachers have brought podcasting into their classroom?
I think some of the best ways is just listening to them and having students listen to podcasts, to hear those outside voices. I like podcasts being used right now as a first primary source, because a kid can go out inside and take a walk while listening to it. Especially where we're remote learning, we're on the screens a lot. So if you can give students something to listen to instead and go take a walk, 30-minute walk, listen to this, student can still get content, but not be sitting in front of the screen.
Yeah, I used to be really into running, and I would listen to podcasts while I ran. But I would always start with a warm up that was from a podcast. And I've heard, although we haven't done this at my school, but I have heard about PE teachers who will podcast some physical activities for their kids, so their kids can just phone earbuds and they're not staring at the screen or stuck in the same room. They can go outside or wherever it is they have space to get that workout done.
Ooh, I love that. I love hearing that PE teachers are innovating in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. In my school, I've really stuck with history and language arts, although I think there's a lot of space to talk about to podcast in just about every single subject. Like there's a million science podcasts out there. And so many of them are good. But I
So many
do
good ones.
find that in history and language arts, it's really easy to have a debate or to take two sides of an issue. And that's always a really good way to frame a podcast. If there's something to discuss or something that is easy to see from multiple sides, that's always a great starter.
Yeah, last year in our journalism class, one of my students, his podcast was always a Q and like based on a Q and A, and each week was a different question that people would debate. So, like one week it was like our are hot dogs tacos, or like then around Christmas time, it was like, is Die Hard a Christmas movie? And so he would get a group of kids in and just talk about those topics.
It's funny, and I'm kind of jumping ahead, but that was one thing that I had my students listen to your students' podcast, that particular one, just to get them thinking about how they were really good. My younger kids, my sixth graders at the time, were really good at taking the idea of an essay and turning it into a podcast. That was an easy first step for them, but I wanted to I wanted them to push themselves into making it more of a dialogue. And I thought that was a great attainable example of, here's something that students do here in this county, like, that you could try to sort of emulate or take your own spin on.
Yeah, I think getting kids to ask good questions is really important part of the podcasting process, to make sure they're asking big, open questions to solicit a lot of response from the person they're talking with. You don't want to just ask those yes and no questions. So I think when I do podcasting with students, I really work on that question asking phase, or the development of the script or the outline of the podcast, is to make it to get as much content as possible.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And that's such an important communication skill too, that they just need to have. Like, here's how human beings really talk to each other. In middle school, you really need to address that, but I guess in high school also.
Oh, 100%. Especially, with English language learners, because they're questioning. I've worked with groups and classes of English language learners sharing their stories of immigration, which was really cool. But getting them to ask good questions and answer freely was an important skill to learn.
Yeah, I will say that I do like podcasting with English language learners too, and I know some people think that might be a little intimidating for them, but especially when they're able to work in pairs or small groups, I think it's easier for them to join in a dialogue than to take an assessment where they sort of have to talk into the computer by themselves. Can be intimidating. And I think also sometimes they feel more free speaking out loud than they do if they were asked to write an essay, because there's so many more layers of complexity when you have to add writing into the mix. So I've found it to be successful with some of my higher level ELLs.
Yeah, we've found it very successful too. And I really like just having them do it together, and not maybe having outside, me not participating or another teacher participating, just letting them run the conversation. I think lowers that like cognitive load for them.
I agree. I mean, as much as the actual recording process can have none of me in it, the better.
Exactly.
With my younger kids, I do find that especially at first, they like me to be a part of it, to act as a moderator and to help kind of guide the conversation. But as they grow in confidence, they need me less. And I like removing myself because whatever, I have a platform. I don't, I
Right.
think they deserve their own.
100%, 100%.
So other ways to use podcasting beyond classroom projects are to connect with the community at large. Katie, do you have any ways that you use podcasting with families and communities?
Yeah, well, I don't, but my school does. So
Yeah.
last year, our counselors created a podcast for parents about the college admission process. It had probably been 20 years since many of the parents had applied to college, and that process has changed greatly in that time. So our counselors made a podcast for parents to lead them through those steps and what to expect in 2019 as applying to college is like. And I think that was really helpful. And right now we have two of our TOSAs at our school, and they're planning to hand the podcast off to students eventually. But they are doing What's Up Woodbridge, and it's like a community podcast, and they've interviewed all different people at our school. I think it's been really nice to have that, especially while we're remote, especially for new students, to kind of be able to get to meet some people at the school in a virtual way.
That's
What about you?
awesome.
Yeah.
No. This is I'm just being completely honest. This is definitely a stretch goal. My principal is kind of a higher profile figure. And so I've talked to him about the possibility of doing a podcast at some point. I love the idea of that being something that we make into a form of communication, like a school newsletter. We send out emails weekly, and we use a lot of phone calls, but I think this would be a really amazing way to connect with people. So it's something that we sort of have bounced around the idea and have in the works, but nothing yet.
Yeah, well, more for the future.
Yeah, right.
2021.
Stay tuned. Yeah, I don't think it'll be a thing we start in virtual, but once we get back in there and doing things, we've got a studio where it could happen, and so it's just a matter of getting all the pieces in place.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we talked about kids and families, but there's also opportunities to use podcasting for professional development. How have you done that, Katie?
I've used one-off episodes, so I haven't done like a whole book study, like, oh, we're going to listen to this whole podcast season. But I've used one episode. Hey, let's, I've done it asynchronously. Listen to the episode and reply in this flip grade about what you thought about the episode. That way, it's really like do it on your own time, PD, and that's been pretty successful at my school.
Yeah. So for me, this was my gateway into podcasting. I have actually, I think probably the first time I thought about podcasting in terms of education was when another ITC in our district sent an email out that had it was a link to a podcast called the EdTech Takeout, which I hadn't heard of, but has become one of my favorite podcasts out there. And the ITC was like, "Hey, we should do this. We all could do something like this." And then he retired, and I never talked to him about it, but I got this little itch in my brain about it. And a couple months later, we were at the Vista conference, and somebody in Fairfax was using podcasting for professional development. And so I happened to attend that session with a different ITC, and he and we started a podcast, which we ran for a couple of seasons. It's on hiatus right now. Virtual
always come back.
It may come back one day.
I mean, Saved by the Bell just came back again, so anything is possible.
Is it officially back?
Yeah, it's back.
Okay, I knew it was coming. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do as soon as we end this. Because I've seen the previews, but I hadn't actually watched it.
Zach Morris becomes governor of California.
I'm so excited. And AC Slater looks like he's the same age.
He does.
So anyway, we had a great time working in that podcast. And one of the reasons that we did it, and we got all the equipment through a grant promising to do this, is to offer it as a professional development opportunity for the county. And so we had a form that people could fill out when they listened to it, just to give us enough meaningful feedback that we could gauge that they had in fact listened to it, or at least skimmed it. And then we were able to track that for points. So it was cool to be able to work with our supervisor to, make sure that was all on the up and up. But it was a great way to connect, and we had a wonderful time talking to different educators about it. So we learned a lot from doing the podcast, and I hope other people learned something from. Hey, you were on it, Katie.
I was, yeah. I think I was Team Google versus Microsoft. This little debate podcast.
It was. That was fun. I think you might have won that one.
I mean, I think Google wins often.
Okay, so that's when you do it. Let's talk about how you do it.
Yeah. The first thing, you got to have kids listen. That is
absolutely
key.
We have some resources at that link that we shared out, where we have some curated lists of podcasts that are worth listening to. Katie, what do you have your kids listen to before they start?
I think it depends in the class that I'm going into, what content area it is. But I kind of have a few go-to English podcasts or science podcasts. I usually try and keep them under 5 minutes for those first listens, because that's what we're having them create, like so short podcasts. So I really love Shortwave from NPR. I think that's a really great, inquisitive science podcast that's short and good to go to, even for English class. What about you?
My one of my go-tos that is science and English is the Story Collider, which is a grown-up non-educational podcast that I listen to. Do you listen to it? Because you're nodding.
Story Collider, yeah, I do.
Yeah. So I had reached out to them on Twitter once and said, "Hey, I love your podcast, but sometimes when I listen to it, I hear a surprise F-bomb. And what can I do with kids?" And so they recommended, they curated a list just for me, which is on the Wakelet of resources. But I love it because it's not under 5 minutes. It's the stories are 10 to 15 max. But
Why
the
didn't they call
stories
this the Biz List?
they should have.
They should have.
But yeah, so it's ones for they chose some of their greatest hits for younger audiences. So I really like that one, and the stories are usually a good combination of heartfelt and funny. Um, so I pair those with really professionally well crafted ones. With I like listening to the winning submissions from the NPR podcast challenge that I talked about already. Because especially then you can listen to something that's attainable. Like, here's something of a very high standard, but kids your age did this without much help.
Right, exactly. I think it's good to have them to see what their peers are doing, not someone who's, gone to university and studied like radio editing.
Right. Exactly. And then there's a great website called ListenWise that it's a freemium website, but you can find a lot of short content specific episodes there. And that's definitely worth checking out too. Just because it is an educational product. Um, so when we actually dive into doing it, it's a lot more than sitting down in front of a microphone and just chatting. Katie, do you find that students are surprised about the amount of work they have to do to actually create a podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they think, oh, when they're going to do a podcast, that they're getting out of the writing process, but they're not getting out of the writing process at all. It's kind of like a trick that we play on them. They, oh, you're going to podcast. Oh, cool. We can talk. No, you actually need to do planning before and outlining, and then you got to practice, and then you record. And the recording is probably like the smallest part, because then you're going to go into producing or editing, and that can take a while if you're doing some like really refined editing. If you've, recorded for an hour and you want to make a 5-minute podcast, that can be really the bulkiest part of the system.
Yeah, that was the thing that my students too felt was kind of overwhelming when we first started working on it. And I was like, I'd say, okay, so I'm going to give you this amount of time for research, and they'd work on it. And I'd say, okay, who's ready to record? And not one of them was, because the idea of sitting down in front of a microphone, they wanted to bring their A game. And so they wanted to work hard to get ready for it. Similarly, they wanted to make sure they sounded perfect afterwards. So a ton of time spent in that production phase.
Yeah.
So just to break, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say to break that down a little bit further and talk through all of those steps. We want to start the kids with a conversation. What do you use to kind of kickstart a lesson, Katie?
I actually have a hyperdoc, and I think it's shared in this Wakelet. If not, I can get it in there.
It is.
I have
Totally is.
Yeah, a hyperdoc that kind of leads them through like, what is podcasting? We have that video, the little SNL skits part of the hyperdoc, which is all about, podcasting is about connecting with other people. And so, leads them through what podcasting is, and then, leads them into the engaging part where they create something. So that's kind of how I start the podcasting conversation, just introducing them to what podcasting is. And then we get into them talking about their specific topics, or trying to narrow down their topic if they're still in that part of the phase.
Yeah, same. We, especially in middle school, we spend a lot of time on introducing what a podcast is, because especially little sixth graders don't always know, or they say, oh yeah, my dad listens to such and such, but they don't have their own experience of it. So there's a lot of time spent just sort of building the groundwork for it. Although by 8th grade, my students tend to know and won't tell me the names of the podcasts they listen to, because they don't think I should be listening. But helping them make that switch in their head from this is great, this is something we can do in school is also good. But yeah, I spend a lot of time talking to teachers first about it. So I think the teachers probably spend more time with the preparation, and I spend with the kids, and I spend that time with the teachers.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Um, and then having them actually work. I mean, we've already talked about the amount of time they put into research. And I don't have a handout that I use with my kids like consistently, but I do find that having some kind of framework for them, usually it's individual by class, has been really helpful.
Yeah, and I know actually Billy really likes having them do this on a Padlet.
Oh,
Like, do
really?
their outlining process on a Padlet. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's really smart. It's a really
Mhm.
great way to keep a collaborative conversation going with like resources built in. I love
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
idea. Oh, Padlet. What don't you do?
It's such a great tool.
And also just an important note that I would say here in my very first experience with podcasting, which was with a 6th grade language arts class. I didn't know what I was doing. And the teacher and I agreed that it'd be a great step up from essays. And so we had the kids write essays first, and then the podcast is supposed to be sort of an extension of that. Um, but because they had written the whole essay, they just wanted to read it. They
Mhm.
felt like they had this finished product. And so the podcasts were a little bit dry because it wasn't organic. It wasn't a natural conversation. Even though there were lots of them involved in each episode, they just took turns reading paragraphs. So there was nothing conversational about it or or different from why didn't you just leave it as an essay. We spiced it up in the editing process eventually by adding sound effects and stuff and letting them play with that. And so that gave it an extra layer. But I do feel like, well, after that, I never again asked them to write a whole essay. It was not a big win,
Yeah,
except as
just
a
like
learning
it's just like, when the kid just reads their PowerPoint at the front of the class.
that is exactly what it was. Right. Which is not valid life preparation.
Right, right.
Unless you want to read these slides out loud right now, in which case we need to take
I
a
guess
turn.
I do that for the next 15 minutes.
All right. So after the outlining, then kids do the preparing and practice. So do you have any great stories of kids who are just kind of their first experience of diving in and doing the practice part?
I have lots of kids that just tell me to go away at the studios when they're practicing. They're just like they like close the blinds. They're like just stay away. Like that's okay. They like want their privacy for their practice, and they want that part of the process to be a little bit more discreet, and that's okay. I get that when I practice. I like to be in my zone. Um, I've also heard and seen Flipgrid is a really great medium to do practice. So maybe before they come into the studio, especially now that Flipgrid has that mic only mode, and you could do it before by just putting like a board up, like a whiteboard up on the Flipgrid. But students could just do the audio and record there, and then listen to themselves back there that way.
My experience is that when I tell my kids to practice, they don't want to. Um, and so I have dealt with that by saying, okay, let's go ahead and record and see how it goes. And then they go ahead and start to record and say, wait, we need to start this over again. And I'm like, okay, you're describing practice. So I do think that like they need a sort of a different mindset around practice as not being a a waste of their time, but I think they realize that it's a necessary piece of it.
As Billy would say, that's when he's going to get all the B-roll that he's
Right.
he's apparently building up for us to have some expose in the future. I'm not sure.
Oh, and I feel like that is a good tip though. I always have my students start recording before they're ready to start recording, because I feel like a lot of times they talk to each other about what they're gonna say just to like kind of get ready. And I'm like, oh, you're using up all your good content now. Make sure you edit that in later.
Yeah, it is when really good nuggets come out, is some of that storming process.
We do the same thing. Like we record
We do.
with all of our conversation. I have no idea what terrible things
I know.
could be pulled. And so then when you go ahead and record, quality matters. How do you try to cultivate a space that is conducive to podcasting for your kids?
Yeah. So, like I said, we have a nice studio that we were able to take an old office and turn it into a studio in the library. It's accessible to kids. We have like a booking service, so students can just book it on their own. But it is quiet and has nice professional equipment. Right now, for me, podcasting at home is just me going into my room, and now with this lovely microphone provided by Santa Billy, I get good sound quality.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. We are lucky enough to have the same type of space in our school. We have my school was built in 1963, and one of the things they built into it was a TV production studio. And obviously, that a lot of wires have come and gone from that room, and it functions very differently than it did in the 60s. But it is nice that it is built to be kind of a soundproof space away from everything else that can be used during the day, even like when classes are going on or after school. And so we use it as a little bit of everything, but we have our podcast equipment set up in there. And we spent the time to like paint it and put comfortable furniture in there. So when the kids walk in, and it's kind of hidden from the school. So unlike yours, it's in the library, which is awesome and inviting. Ours, like a lot of times the kids don't even know it exists until I bring them in there. And without fail, they look around and they're like, whoa. And so I think that having them enter that space and feel like, oh, this is something special makes them raise the bar for themselves and the quality of the work that they do there.
Yeah, that's great. They do get very excited when they see in my school the equipment. And I've had kids walk in and be like, "Oh, we're gonna do this," and they walk in, they go, "Oh man, this is legit." And and it's like their attitude just totally changes about the project, and they get excited.
Yeah. And so I think a tip with that too is that this is best done with a school's budget and not an individual's budget. Because if you do want to get some of the good quality stuff, it can get kind of pricey. But it's not pricey for a school. It's just pricey to try to buy out of pocket.
I agree. And we do have a great list of hardware that our colleague Billy has cultivated on the Wakelet.
And so then after, this is my students' least favorite part of podcasting, is the production part. Editing is tough. How do you teach it?
Well, yeah, it is tough. I think you have to like listen to all of your raw recording first, and everyone can like take notes while the recording's playing, and like say okay, and like mark down times that they really liked and that they want to include. And then if you're doing this as a collaborative process, and then go like compare notes and see was the good parts, and then how, if we take these parts and put them together, what story are we going to tell? Because your story can sound very different depending on how you manipulate it. What
Absolutely.
about you?
So I just try to steer my students to the main parts, because generally we don't have a ton of time we don't commit a ton of time to editing, because my younger kids get a little caught up in the details of it. I guess we call it the editing, not the revision part in terms of writing. So they want to cut out every single verbal filler or pause. They get really interested in just making their voices sound perfect. So a lot of time goes into that. And we also focus on like the big stuff, like editing the volume. But I think what we try to do is a little less of the cropping stuff and moving it around. Although they are always amazed at even just a couple of ways you can do that and how it can change the tone of something, what you can put first. So, but yeah, I think we've probably spent a little less time on it because they get tired of it much more quickly than they get tired of talking to each other or practicing.
Yeah, I agree. This is probably the part they don't love the most, except when they get to add sounds and transitional sounds. They love that part.
Oh, yes, that part for sure they love. But also I do feel like they feel like it's worth it too, that when they
Yeah.
finally get to hear it published somewhere. So yeah, I think that that's the one reason that even though they don't love this portion of it, they don't want to quit it either because they know that somebody's going to hear what they did and they want it to sound fantastic for them.
And that's one reason I love Soundtrap is because, if this can be a really lengthy part of the process. And Soundtrap is all web-based and they can do it at home, continue it at home if, after school time is taken up. So that's nice.
Yeah, that's a huge piece of it. And it's collaborative, right? So multiple
It is.
editors. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I've already talked about the fact at length that I teach younger kids. So for me, that's been a challenge with podcasting because so many platforms require. Like I love Anchor. I think it's one of the easiest, simplest things to use. It's very welcoming and intuitive, but it strictly prohibits the use by anyone under the age of 13, even with parent permission. So for me, a lot of what we've done is record things locally, or if we host them somewhere, we'll put them on a school website page or something like that. So it's not just downloadable from Spotify. Or like I said, with the NPR podcast, we have done a lot of, I guess, just a lot of paperwork to make sure we're protecting their rights. But I find also too that it's great to have a teacher who runs a podcast and asks students to do a guest episode on something that's connected to their own Anchor account. So there's a lot of workarounds for the younger kids. Katie, you have a great one with Google Slides.
Yeah, maybe I can share my screen real quick
Yeah.
and I can show. Yeah, so I like to have kids just make a Google slide. And so if you are maybe like a Google Classroom school or even Canvas classroom, you can assign a slide as a template as an assignment. So each kid gets their own copy, and then they can create the podcast there in the Google slide and then turn that in. So it's like a way for especially under 13 to create a podcast, even cover art and all, but it's not public. And so you're not having to worry about the FERPA and the COPA issues of publicizing it out into the world. So, yeah.
Then that's fantastic. And just like a couple of the other things that we are generally passionate about, in addition to child privacy, is just, always taking that into account and thinking about keeping things public or private. And if things are posted publicly, adhering to copyright laws too is a big one I've thought a lot about. My students love nothing more than pulling music off YouTube and saying, can we use this? And the answer is not if you're going to play it for anyone other than me.
Yeah,
because it's not yours.
but everyone else samples. Well, we're not going to do that.
Right. And do you want to talk about accessibility, Katie? I know that's something that's close to your heart.
Yeah, I love podcasts, but not everyone has the hearing to be able to enjoy them. So if you are going to be able to create a podcast, it's nice to teach students to create a transcript of that content.
I love it. So we are about to wrap up. Before I go to our closing slide, did we forget to say anything?
I think we covered it all. I think we covered our highlights.
I think so too. All right then. So I think that's a great way to wrap. We would love to talk to you more about podcasts. You can definitely hit us up on Twitter at KDF, original Twitter adopter with an amazing handle. Or me, Busy ITC. It's wordplay.
I think your handle is pretty great.
I didn't even make it up, but I totally own it. And you can find all the resources. I know is already in the chat, but you can go to podcasts.unisonedu.org to see links to everything that we talked about.
Yeah. Thanks for coming, guys.
Enjoy some snow tomorrow.